Lovely to see you. Happy Christmas to everybody. And what a lovely Christmas tree you've got on your right shoulder.
Thank you very much. I do love Christmas, as everybody here probably knows. So tell us, who was St. Nicholas?
Let me start by saying he was a 3rd century Byzantine bishop of the very early church. So late Roman, I suppose into the 3rd century of the Christian period, a Byzantine bishop who originates from Turkey, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, which happens to be a part of the world I know very well through my travels and my travel writing. And in fact, that's why I first came across this strange notion that this figure at the heart of our Christmas celebrations should actually come from a country which, albeit having a long Christian history, is now largely Muslim. And that struck me as interesting. And it might be worth me briefly just showing a map to give you a kind of sense of where he comes from in Turkey and where that fits into the overall picture. So if that's all right with you.
That sounds great.
Lucinda, I'm very, very quickly going to share my screen. And I'm then going to bring up this picture here, which you should all be able to see, which very briefly is a map of Europe extending as far as Turkey. Can you all see this? I think you probably can.
Yes, definitely. And what I love is the only place that's highlighted in the UK is Winchester.
Indeed, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. So if you can see my cursor down to the bottom right, this is Turkey here, and Demre, Myra, that I'm now focused on, was the site of his bishopric, where he was actually based, and Patara, just along the coast, is where he was actually born. So this is the area. I came across the fact of this and was fascinated by it and decided it was time to find out a little bit more about him. And while I'm actually on this, while I'm sharing screen, I'm just going to go for one more, just to give you a early picture of what he might perhaps have looked like, or at least is represented as through the centuries. And that, in fact, was on a very small trinket that I bought outside his church in Myra some 15 years ago, when I was deep in beginning the exploration of this story. I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can come back.
So that was fascinating. So he had quite stylized kind of facial hair, and he was losing his hair on top. And he looked a bit like a medallion man. What was the medallion around his neck?
This is kind of a classic early Orthodox insignia, a representation of his position in office. So he, as I say, he's an early Byzantine bishop. His dates, as far as we know, are about 280 to 350 AD. The issue with St. Nicholas is that very little is known about him as a historical figure. We only have 1 or 2 references to him, or at least to his martyrium, to the place where he was buried, that is to say, this church in this place called Myra in Turkey. We don't have anything else at all. So there is this remarkable notion of this figure coming from almost nowhere, historically speaking, and then establishing himself in all kinds of interesting ways on his journey to becoming Santa Claus. That's in fact a long way ahead. The first thing I want to say at this stage is that him being based in Myra in southern Turkey, which is a port, actually means that there are natural associations with the sea from a very early stage in the story of St. Nicholas. And if I can just share one more time with you at this point, I just want to bring up one other image, which is this one. And this is a stone at the church, which is the Church of St. Nicholas in this place called Myra in southern Turkey. It's where he originally, his bones, his sarcophagus originally lay. And this is a really interesting image because what it shows is a cross, a classic cross, but with anchor flukes attached to the bottom. So it's important that St. Nicholas primarily becomes the patron saint of sailors.
That's absolutely beautiful. It's a really beautiful image.
It's a lovely thing. And it really matters because if you think of that that little port where he was the bishop in the early Christian periods. And actually, what's important is that it's on the trade routes to the east, it's on the pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land, and it's also on the Crusader routes, as they will be 800, 900 years later. So he's, in a sense, very well positioned in terms of creating a cult for himself from this otherwise apparently quite remote place right down on the Mediterranean coast. And the question that I wanted to ask is, how does he then translate from that and become this really important figure in the Christian world? How does that even begin to happen?
And how does it begin to happen? Because I find it's so intriguing to think that this is a real person, real living person who has become this incredible myth all over the world.
I think several things are in play in terms of how this goes about. I think the great thing about becoming the patron saint of sailors, and remember that this is the early Christian centuries when the old pagan gods are being replaced by saints. So Poseidon, who is the very important pagan god of the sea and the protector of sailors, is removed, or is being removed, by the time we're talking about, say, 300 AD. And there is this process whereby prominent Christian figures are replacing them. St. Nicholas, I think, commends himself because he happens to be associated with a port which is very important to sailors. It's the stopping off place, as I say, on the route to the east. And we know that there were plenty of early pagan temples to Poseidon in Myra. And it seems that he was just in the right place, in a sense, at the right time. And the great thing about being the patron saint of sailors and the protector of sailors is that every sailor who successfully gets to where he or she is trying to get to hymns your praises, and everyone that fails keeps stum about it. So it tends to work virally as a way of expanding and extending a cult. And this is what seems to have happened to St. Nicholas. And there are all over the world, all over the Christian world at least, there are headlands, islands, breakwaters, churches, chapels in his name. And normally they are associated with the sea. And even if you think of Britain, so many of the British ports, Gloucester, Southampton, various ones in London, Bristol, they all have a prominent church to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors. So that, if you like, is the vehicle whereby he comes to great prominence.
Right. How fascinating. And I guess they were kind of talking about it in taverns and, putting up shrines to him, and everyone's thinking, who's this saint? And I need to pray to him if I'm getting on board a ship. So as you say, it kind of went viral.
It went viral, exactly. He became very, very important. And there are these early references to his importance all over the Christian world. But what's interesting about this is that he was distinctive as a saint in being what is called a confessor saint rather than a martyr saint. He's obviously of the period when lots of saints were being martyred spectacularly and becoming famous for him. He lived to be an old man, and it's for that reason that he had time to attach lots of stories to himself in terms of the things that he managed to do. Quite a lot of these stories had a miraculous element. They were to do with saving sailors, obviously. They were to do with saving foundering cargoes, which he managed to get delivered safely to the port to which they were intended. He managed to spring the falsely accused out of prison. But the story that absolutely defines him is one that, again, I want to share a screen in a minute, but it's a story called The Three Daughters. And The Three Daughters effectively tells of an event that happened when he was a young man in Patara, which is the port just down the coast from Myra, where he was born and where he grew up. And in Patara, Nicholas becomes aware of an impoverished nobleman in the town who is proposing to put his three daughters into prostitution by way of raising some money to at least feed the family. And St. Nicholas takes it upon himself to arrive at night secretly and to provide each of these girls with a dowry donation in the form of a bag of gold. Let me just share the screen briefly to bring you up one of these images, which I will then describe. Here. This is an image on a triptych from a Perugia church dated the 1430s, and it's by an artist called Fra Angelico. And you can see on the right, St. Nicholas slipping through a window, what is quite hard to see, but it is a gold dowry bag, into the interior where the cutaway shows the three daughters in bed and the nobleman having a bit of a moment, wondering how he's going to resolve this problem. Let me just come out of the share stop. And there are all over the world, in any number of forms, representations of this same story, shown in hagiographies, in books, in stained glass windows, in frescoes, in stonework. And in fact, you mentioned Lucinda, Winchester. Anybody who knows Winchester Cathedral well may know the Tournai font, which is a beautiful 12th century black marble font on which the story of the St. Nicholas, the three daughters, is represented as well. So if you know where to look, you will find this story all over the Christian world. And it's absolutely, of all of the stories, the one that probably defines St. Nicholas most importantly. And I think what's fascinating about this is that, unlike a lot of the saints who tied their reputations to the miraculous, this is a really good example of one of those stories which is utterly believable. There's no sense of miracle about it. It's simply an act of charity. And that may be why it resonates so strongly and is so important. If you look at, for example, the Russian experience of St. Nicholas is incredibly important in Russia. He's the patron saint. And he appears in various forms. He's known as St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker for some of his miraculous achievements. He's known as St. Nicholas as the Sea, but he's best known as St. Nicholas Ugodnik, which effectively means St. Nicholas the Helper. And that's absolutely essential to the telling of the St. Nicholas story.
And it's fascinating as well, because you mentioned, which I'd not thought about before, the fact that he wasn't martyred, that he became an old man. And of course, there, if we think about modern day Father Christmas representations, a man with a long white beard. St. Nicholas actually had the time in which to become an older man and to grow a long white beard. So I guess that does mark him out from quite a lot of the saints who, of course, were martyred and murdered much too young.
Isn't that fascinating? When you think of all the kind of young martyred saints, and they're all represented in their youth. And I think you're right that there is probably some connection between the notion of the kindly old man, albeit it's also interesting that when he does make this act of charity, he is a young man. He does this as a young man in his youth. Nevertheless, the notion of the kindly old man is obviously something that, we're jumping ahead now, is obviously something that carries across into the story that we're going to get onto in due course.
And just to say that perhaps that the Three Sisters was possibly just one act. I mean, if that was the kind of person that he was, presumably there were many others that perhaps haven't made it down the annals of oral history, but at the time it could have been something that he did very regularly, that people expected those kind of things. So that would all add to this.
I think that's exactly right. I think it is symbolic of the charitable character, the charitable personality. And it's basically a way of saying this is a value that we all in the early Christian church respond to and acknowledge. And it's also known, actually, there are various examples, if you look at the historical instances of benefactors in the period in question, so between 200 and 300 AD, that in fact, in a couple of the ancient city sites near to Myra and Patara, there are inscriptions which hymn the virtues of particular benefactors, and saying that one of the things they did was provide dowries to orphaned girls. So there is this notion that there is probably an element of truth in backing this story, but you're also right to say that there is no reason why that was the only act of charity that he undertook. It simply symbolizes the wider notion of acts of charity and acts of goodwill to fellows, to people in difficult situations.
So after his death, how did he die? Did he died of old age?
As far as we know, he died of old age. Again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, there's very little known about him historically. There are a couple of references. The only references we have to him are actually to the existence of his martyrium to his place of burial from about the 500s. The rest is simply what emerges in this strange kind of notion of kind of the making of a saint and how that actually happens. And that's what's so fascinating about it. Yeah. So
tell us about that. How does that happen?
Well, he dies in 350, and we then can only speculate as to how it is that we know that by 550, his martyrium, his burial place in Myra, is highly regarded, highly visited. Lots of pilgrims are coming, but we don't have any detail at all about as to how that process takes place. But I suppose it goes back to this notion that there is a great deal of drive behind these newly established saints with their newly established territories. In the first case, in the case of St. Nicholas, the patronage of seafarers. And it just begins to attract people. One of the things about St. Nicholas, which is really interesting, is that other than seafarers, he has any number of other patronages too. And I think that's the consequence of having a long life. It's the consequence, for example, of elements of the stories which get picked up on. So the fact that it is a impoverished, noble merchantman that he goes to the help of means that he becomes the patron saint in some cultures of merchants. He becomes the patron saint of any number of other things too. Because he saves cargoes, he becomes the patron saint of stevedores. He becomes the patron saint of any number of interesting and fascinating things. Amongst them, in fact, the patron saint of prostitutes, because he saves these 3 girls from prostitution. And fascinatingly, he's also the patron saint of pawnbrokers. And that is because the 3, if you think of pawnbrokers, outside their window, the symbol is of the 3 gold balls. And those are, of course, the 3 bags of gold, which he delivers to the 3 girls to redeem them.
Wow. Did not know where that came from. That's fascinating.
That's where that comes from. Yes.
Where's the story of you might be left a lump of coal? Am I jumping forwards a great deal for that?
You're jumping forward a huge distance, but that's fine. We can very briefly deal with that, because when St. Nicholas, well, let me not pick up on that now. But that allows us to move forward. Let me come back to that in a moment, because there's a very important moment that we need to talk about, which continues the notion of how it is that he becomes so important and so well known. We know that he is lying in his grave. His relic bones are lying in his grave at Myra, and there's a great deal of interest in him. And we also know that by the 11th century, his shrine, his sarcophagus, is under threat from the Muslims, because the Muslims are advancing from the east. And a group of freebooters from the Norman Italian city of Bari take it upon themselves to steal the relic bones of St. Nicholas and bring them back to Bari, which would be, of course, a great coup. This is called in the time translation, the translation of relic bones of a saint from one place to another, either because the other place feels that it would do their reputation good, or because the place where they're lying is in some way threatened, as in this case. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, that St. Mark was translated in the same way from Alexandria to Venice in 828. So in 1087, this fleet of Norman Bariot from Bari in Italy, freebooters, descend on the church at Myra, and they basically cajole the monks into releasing into revealing where the relic bones are, which they then remove in a casket, take back to Bari in 1087, where a huge and beautiful Gothic cathedral, which some of you may have seen, is actually raised over his remains. So there's this sense in which he's moved very timely from Myra, which is kind of disappearing into the Muslim world, into the heart of the Christian world at just the moment when the Crusades are about to happen. So again, he's in the right place to attract all these people moving through. And I think that gives that much more kind of impetus and weight to his cult, and actually takes him centrally into Europe and into Christendom at just the right time. So that's a really, really important moment. And anybody who knows Bari well, it's a really interesting town. Brief share screen, just if I may. One more image. This is, if you go to Bari Old Town and you walk around, on all the walls there are these wonderful, wonderful images of St. Nicholas. It's absolutely the heart of St. Nicholas, the St. Nicholas cult, and it's wonderful.
Beautiful.
So basically, I've got you to the point that he's established in Europe, and he's the patron saint of sailors. And it's now that the story of the three daughters begins to kick in and move ahead. And I mentioned that because that will eventually get us to what you were asking about, the chunks of coal. St. Nicholas Day falls on December the 6th. It was in the Greek world, in the Orthodox world, it was always December the 6th. And that is also adopted in the Catholic world as the date on which he is commemorated. And a tradition arises whereby on December the 6th, gifts are given by the parents, but apparently on behalf of St. Nicholas, to the children. And this takes place certainly from the 12th or 13th century, right across the Christian world. It also takes place actually in England as well. So you've got this sense, December the 6th, gifts being given in honor, if you like, of St. Nicholas and honoring the gifts that he made, these acts of charity to these three daughters. So you've got the beginning of a sense that we're moving towards a story that we may all recognize, but with a different name. And the key there is Amsterdam. Of all the great ports that adopt St. Nicholas, Amsterdam and the other Dutch ports tend to be the most important. St. Nicholas becomes very, very important in Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, in Dutch, St. Nicholas is rendered as Sint Heer-Klaas. Sint Heer-Klaas, which is, I suppose, the Dutch for Saint Lord Nicholas. And from Sint Heer-Klaas, we eventually will get Santa Claus.
I've been wondering I was wondering if there were two different saints who were kind of amalgamated together, but it's the same saint.
It's the same saint.
The name that gets kind of changed in translation.
It's the same saint, the name gets changed, and this is obviously the next element where we then begin to move into the Americanization of Sint Heer-Klaas, so that he then becomes Santa Claus.
But here we call him Father Christmas. So
indeed.
Where does that come from? Is that a whole other route, or is that a much later?
It's fascinating. Let's go to Father Christmas very briefly. Father Christmas originally was a sort of master of ceremonies figure who was not actually related to the giving of gifts. He would go around from house to house at Christmas time. He was tended to be dressed in green, and he would jolly along, exactly. He would jolly along the party in particular people's houses. He'd be given mince pies, and he effectively introduced the Christmas festivals. But he had a distinct role from the gift-giving role that St. Nicholas had in relation to December the 6th, and would have in the guise of Santa Claus in relation to December the 25th in due course. So the Father Christmas thing is really interesting, because certainly when I was growing up, I'd barely heard of Santa Claus. My parents insisted on calling this character Father Christmas. But what effectively happens, and this is jumping ahead, is that when Santa Claus is established in the States from the mid-19th century, he's then exported to Britain, where he and Father Christmas tend to become amalgamated and become one. And I guess the American version, what in the way of American versions, tends to take over. And Father Christmas in his original form, although he keeps the name, loses the color and the function and simply becomes a reversioning of Santa Claus.
So was the Father Christmas originally, is this the kind of like ancient mummers?
Correct.
Like the
Correct. He sort of goes back to sort of pagan Saturnalia, end of the year celebrations, the
idea of the green man. I mean, we when you look at the John Leech illustrations of Christmas Carol, the Ghost of Christmas Present looks a bit like a modern day Father Christmas, but a bit like the Green Man, and he's in green and white. Is that
exactly right? That's the best way of imagining him. He's much closer to the Green Man than to what we now understand Father Christmas to be.
Right. Gosh, that's so fascinating. And so I just want to ask actually how you decided you were going to write about him, because there's so little known. What made you think, I'm going to do a biography of this person?
Well, I think because I have this fascination with Turkey, and I was thoroughly astonished to discover that that's where he had his beginnings. And it struck me as a travel writer that if one wanted to, one could follow this extraordinary posthumous story. It's not really about the life. It's about the elements attached to the life, which then go on this extraordinary developing arc through time, the way that a cult changes and is affected. And I love the idea of thinking, if this begins, as it seems to do in Myra, Turkey, and it ends in Lapland or the North Pole, how do you then trace that journey through what is effectively the whole of Christian history? And where does it take you, and what does it do? So I basically went on the road and I followed this developing cult from Anatolia, Turkey, to Bari, into Central Europe, to Amsterdam, with stop-offs to visit Britain and elsewhere, and then across to Manhattan, which becomes the heart of the Santa Claus story, as we'll get onto that in a minute. And thence, with my own children, to Lapland, because I was actually writing this book when my kids were very young. And part of the inspiration was precisely this, that this figure still seemed to have such importance for them. It was a figure in which they invested so much belief and wonder. And I really, really wanted to explore it from that perspective, yes.
Fantastic. I know it's available on Kindle. I've just put the link into the chat for that. It's got two names, and it's interesting with what you were just talking about, because it says Nicholas, the Epic Journey from Saint to Santa Claus, and also Santa, a Life. Yes,
that's the American and British editions, different names. Yeah. I wanted to say a little bit more, if I may, at this point, about the way that we move from the idea of three daughters to Santa Claus. Here's an image that you need to see. Okay, this is a church in Serbia, and this is a fresco which dates from about 1400. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting here is that I don't know whether you can see it, but if you look at the very bottom, you can see the impoverished nobleman, the three daughters in bed, and in the roof, and this is the earliest instance I'd found, is St. Nicholas putting the dowry bag not through the window, but down a chimney.
Down the chimney, that's fascinating.
Down the chimney. So it's almost as if, I think, with the invention of chimneys and the sense that this character and this story needs to become slightly more fantastical, we change it, we move it. And so there is this gradual movement, and it's quite hard to follow. How do we get from a Byzantine benefactor putting 3 bags of gold through a window to Santa Claus with all the kind of afflatus, all the kind of stuff, bringing sacks of gifts down chimneys. But you can begin to see how even in the Christian telling of the story, that's already beginning to take place. And it's then when St. Nicholas is carried to America, to Manhattan, by the early Dutch settlers, that something of that story goes with them. And then in the 19th century, there's this explosion as New York becomes this extraordinary entrepot, and gifts and industrialization takes place. Suddenly there are these much more beautiful manufactured gifts, and they're looking for a marketplace. How do we actually sell these to people? Well, we use St. Nicholas as our means of selling it. And then you've got into this incredible fast forwarding from about 1822, where St. Nicholas is remade as Santa Claus with all this kind of other stuff around him, with sleighs and reindeers, into a figure who actually delivers gifts.
And where does the reindeer come from? Where does the Lapland thing come from? How is suddenly?
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of go quite deep into this, and I think it's kind of a consequence of history. 2 things are going on. One, I'll also cover sleighs as well. Of course, in Manhattan in the 1820s, you would get around by sleigh, not by cart in the wintertime. So that's a natural kind of addition. Put sleighs in. And interestingly, jingle bells is a consequence of the fact that sleighs moving across snow are very quiet, and they were added as a safety mechanism, effectively, you know. So the bells are like a hoot, to warn people that things are going past. In terms of the reindeer, again, anybody who lived in Manhattan in the 1820s, 1830s was very aware of reindeer, because their natural winter territory was not far to the north, so reindeers were very much around. As for the idea of Lapland, it's really interesting. In the early tellings of the Santa Claus story in the States, originally he lives in Manhattan. But I think the problem is that the makers of the story recognize that as people have addresses, where are you actually going to put him? He needs to be somewhere more fantastical. And from the 1840s onwards, of course, everybody's thinking about the frozen north. Everybody's fascinated by the North Pole. You know, the early explorers were trying to get there. There is this extraordinary fascination represented in poetry and in storytelling too, about the frozen sublime. And it seems to me that it's the natural place for Santa Claus to be moved to, because it's beyond reach and it's fantastical, and it's this kind of wonderful representation of all the great elements of winter.
Oh, that's so interesting. I can't believe that Father Christmas used to live in Manhattan.
He did indeed live in Manhattan, yes. That was his place. He never quite had an address, but I think from the moment that the city actually was properly established and people were asking, well, where is he in Manhattan? Then they made the move. So all these kind of elements are, it's the making of a story to make it more believable. I think that's what's going on.
Yeah. Gosh, it is really interesting. When you were researching him, how did you begin? You said there's not that much known about the history of him. So where did you actually start with looking?
Well, I mean, I was aware that there wasn't much known about him as the man, but I was also aware there was all this kind of extraordinary kind of stuff in relation to him. And I spent a lot of time in Bari. I spent a lot of time in Manhattan. I spent a lot of time in Amsterdam, just trying to make sense of how this story was changing. And as I mentioned to you, that early fresco showing St. Nicholas for the first time actually putting a bag of gold down a chimney, I was very much looking for that moment. When is the earliest moment that somebody, for whatever reason, decides to represent him in this different way? And so, yeah, I mean, I did a lot of speculative homework to try and work out how this story develops over the best part of 1800 years.
And I wonder when he started to be used as a kind of tool for making children behave. I mean, I remember when I lived in Austria, and I'd never come across St. Nicholas's Day before, and they all talk about Nikolaus, and you either have St. Nicholas or you have the Krampus, who is the devil. And the children were so terrified that Nikolaus was going to tell them off. And basically, you know, from the 6th of December onwards, if your behavior isn't perfect, and I guess in the American terms, we get the kind of the naughty list or the nice list. But children were so serious. They'd go and talk to St. Nicholas, and they'd have to confess. It was a bit like the confessional in the Catholic Church. They would have to tell St. Nicholas, well, I fought with my brother, and he would say, well, just make sure you don't do it again. And they were so serious about it. When did that start to happen, that he becomes this kind of bogeyman used?
Yes, I mean, in original manifestations of the St. Nicholas Day feast. So if we're talking about, I suppose, from 1350 through to the time that it then becomes Americanized, that's absolutely the heart of it. St. Nicholas, if you're a naughty child, you will get a birch stick. And if you're a good child, you'll get chocolates. There's one more image I want to show you, if I may, which is from the 1650s, Dutch, by an artist called Jan Steen, and it's called The Feast of St. Nicholas. There we are. There's just a couple of elements here I wanted to say to you. If you see the boy on the left, he's the naughty boy. He's tearful. He hasn't got anything at all. He may have been given a birch. The father on the right, do you see the father on the right pointing up the chimney? And actually what you might also see is the baby he's holding, very hard to see, is actually holding a gingerbread figure of St. Nicholas as well. But you're absolutely right. In all those cultures in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, the notion of St. Nicholas, before he gave a gift, you would have to prove yourself as a good child. It's absolutely at the heart of it. yes, you're right in the sense that that has been diluted or lost in the Americanization of the Santa Claus story, but it was absolutely there and at the heart.
So you do a lot of, we know you spent a lot of time in Italy, in Italy and Turkey, you've also spent time in Italy, you write your travel books. What's the reception in Turkey now of the myth of Father Christmas, Santa Claus, St. Nicholas?
It's fascinating. You know, it's in that town, Myra, whose modern name is Demre. It's a very unprepossessing town. In fact, it's agricultural. There's a lot of hot housing there, so there's a lot of kind of scrubby old plastic lying around. There is this notion that this extraordinary story, it has two possible audiences, and then I'm talking tourism now. How do we make tourism work better for our town, where we only grow aubergines? Do we do it by presenting the St. Nicholas, the original St. Nicholas face, or do we do it by presenting the original Santa Claus face? Which is the market we want? If we go for St. Nicholas, we're going to get lots of Russian tourists and Greek tourists. If we go to Santa Claus, we're going to get a whole different thing. And there was this extraordinary moment many years ago when I was researching this book, when the city fathers decided that they were going to go down the Santa Claus route. And at night, one night, they had the St. Nicholas statue removed and replaced by morning by a Santa Claus statue. And there was such a to-do. But it was really interesting. They were trying to work out which of these representations was most useful in terms of kind of transforming the fortunes and the prospects of the town. So I think that's probably the best way of answering that particular question.
And I'm amazed they didn't just keep both.
Well, they could have kept both.
Everybody.
Could have kept both. Yes, that might have been a much better idea. Stay open to both possibilities.
Oh, Jeremy, thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. And in your family, has St. Nicholas become almost like an extra person at the table? Does everybody kind of, I know when you write a biography of someone, for me, they've become very, very close to me. Do you feel very close to St. Nicholas? Do you like the fact that you've been able to bring him to a whole new audience?
Well, I think that there was a time, certainly when the girls were young, when he was very important, and the fact that I'd written about him was important. But, you know, they've now become cynical teenagers, and St. Nicholas has completely disappeared. So it's really nice to talk about him again, because, no, in answer to your question, I don't tend to get that many opportunities to do so these days.
And do you celebrate St. Nicholas's Day on the 6th of December? Do you do something?
I kind of try to remember to do so, and then I don't. I mean, it's really fascinating how we've gone from how one of the things that Nicholas did so brilliantly in becoming Santa Claus was move from the 6th of December to Christmas. So he actually managed, and that's another complicated part of a very complicated story. Gift giving moves from the 6th of December. Initially, it goes to New Year's Day because there was always a big, and then it goes to Epiphany because of gift giving then, the three wise men. But
which now is why it's still so popular in places like Spain, the Three Kings
Indeed,
Day.
Indeed, yeah.
We've had a comment here saying this would make a really good TV program. So there you are.
Thank you very much, Sue. You know, I tried so hard to make that happen, and I totally failed. But yes, I agree, it would. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah, and we've also got a comment. There is a tower built by the Knights of St. John, called St. Nicolau Tower, on the small island of Camino between Malta and Gozo.
There we are then.
Is it there because of the sailors? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeremy, to all of you watching on social media and to all the Goldston members. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. It has been absolutely brilliant learning about St. Nicholas. Thank you so much. And I think we're going to end the live recording now. And a Merry Christmas to you too, for those of you who are putting things into the chat.